Right, so this is topic 1 for Unit 2, the national economy. What I want to get across in this short presentation is what we mean by the economic cycle. We can graph the economic cycle by placing time on the horizontal axis and what we call GDP, or gross domestic product, on the vertical axis. GDP measures the amount of money generated in our economy normally in a year. So this is the value of output across all factors of production in our country in a year. What I want to show on the economic cycle are two different lines. What we have first of all is the trend rate of economic growth. Good way of thinking about this is it's the average rate of economic growth as time goes on. So what we can see is positive. So as time goes on, the output, or the GDP of the country, increases year after year. That line clearly is a smooth, straightish line. Obviously, it's a slight sloping upwards gradient to represent that GDP is increasing as time goes on. What we find, though, that in the short run, our economy doesn't grow quite as smoothly as that. And this green line is our actual growth. And this is our economic cycle. So it shows how our economy changes over a time period. Now, along this line, we've got different parts which I need to point out what these mean. When the rate of economic growth, or GDP growth, is higher than the trend rate, towards the top, we call this a peak. When the economy is falling and it reaches the bottom of the economic cycle, we call this a trough. Two other important parts to point out on this are recession and then recovery. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll take ourselves on a journey explaining what happens at each of these different stages. So at the moment, the time of doing this presentation, the UK was just roughly here. So that meant we were at the bottom of a recession. Now what happens at the bottom of the recession is that the economy will start to head towards recovery. So the rate of economic growth starts to become positive again. The economy will grow until eventually we reach a peak. When we reach a peak, the economy will then start to overheat, grow too quickly, and then nosedive back into a recession. So here the rate of economic growth starts to become negative again. The economy is starting to fall. This will bottom out in a trough and then take us back to a recovery. What we will build up in the next few presentations is why these different stages happen. And two things that I want to get across on this diagram before we end the presentation is what we mean by a negative output gap and what we mean by a positive output gap. Let's rip that off. So let's take the negative output gap first of all. This occurs when the rate of economic growth is below the trend rate. So for example, you can see on our diagram when the economy is in a recession, in a trough, start of recovery, we've got a negative output gap. We're operating below our long run economic growth forecast, our trend rate of economic growth. When we have a positive output gap, the economy is operating above the blue line. So we're heading towards a peak on our economic cycle. Now, what a good economist would try and do is to get this green line, so our actual growth line, as close to the trend rate of economic growth as possible. And what we'll be looking at in the final topic is how the economy tries to do it and why it's so important to do so.